Hello and welcome to another video. Today we'll be taking a look at the LTN-92 navigation system. We've done this before on the Felis 747-2, the classic, specifically focusing on drift and ways to correct for that drift. Now don't forget, the LTN-92 requires and builds upon the older existing INS systems that were already fitted to aircraft of the era. We'll take a look at TMIXing as well as RNAV updates on this one. And on my longer video on the entire thing, I made one mistake, or at least one mistake that stands out to me. And I want to correct that here today, as well as taking a closer look at these specific elements of the system in a bit more detail. So let's crack on with it. And so first off, coming over into Explain 12, we're in the 747. I've paused it, so hopefully this ain't going to mess up too much, because that would be very embarrassing, especially considering I'm doing this on a live stream. And so inside, let's hit P to unpause. We're currently on a flight. Now, you could be on a flight anywhere up at 390, in between the UK and I think Norway. And so let's take a look at what this actually looks like on our Sim Toolkit app. So if we come across, there we see it. Now don't forget, Sim Toolkit pulls its position in from X-Plane and is completely accurate. And so if you want to view it another way, Sim Toolkit Pro, if you've got that hooked up and you're using it, is basically like cheating, because this is going to know exactly where you are, whether your systems are aligned or not. But in any case, it gives us a bit of an overview. The important thing sort of to take away from this is that we're over the sea, and granted we're still quite close to the UK, but if we were really far over the sea, like halfway across the Atlantic or something, we would be away from any VOR beacons for an extended period of time. And the further we are away from beacons, you know, the greater the amount of time that these systems are going to drift without having any possibility to realign. So let's take a look now at what we're talking about with these systems. And I just made a real rudimentary screenshot here, but hopefully it'll make the point. And so the LTN-92s, and you've got this nice sort of screen panel there, you can see on the left that I've ringed, is hooked up to the, as we say, the antiquated INS system. You can see that there on the right. Now, there were three of these systems that you see there on the right in the aircraft, one for the pilot, one for the first officer, one for the flight engineer. And in that box of tricks are a bunch of accelerometers and gyros, one for every dimension. And of course, you've got the three different dimensions, X, Y, and Z. And you can broadly equate that with north and south, one for east and west, and then the Z being for height. This system, as we've said like a million times, and I'll say it another million, is not 100% accurate. It might be 99.99, but it's not 100. And that is why, once you've aligned these three systems, of course, they're all going to agree, because you're telling every system, hey, we're at this exact spot. And so if we take that time to be time zero, or the alignment time, they're all going to agree. Once you've been cruising over the sea for a while, different systems are going to be in slightly different positions. And I'm actually going to, I've prepared a few slides. I'm going to demonstrate this now, because I think instead of trying to memorize all this, and at least if you're anything like me, you find learning things far easier if you understand something. Because if you understand something, it becomes obvious. And if something's obvious, you don't got to try and memorize it, because, well, it's obvious, isn't it? And so let's take a look now at some of these slides. So if I bring you over and show you my desktop here real quick, we're in Photoshop. And I've just created a hypothetical situation here that after 2 hours, let's put a little bit of music on real quiet, this is going to be the situation. Now, of course, it's not to scale. I've left down that there to remind ourselves. And so if we take a look, imagine that this is our route, this black line. We're going from the lower left to the upper right, more or less from the UK to Norway, right? And imagine that we've been going for 2 hours, and here's our aircraft position. And I've drawn it on in red. Now, this is where the system thinks the aircraft is, that red position. But it could be, it is a best guess by the INS system, but of course it could be anywhere within that circle. And again, the reason it could be anywhere within that circle is because of the INS drift. The longer it's been since we aligned the systems, the greater that INS could drift. If we take a look, imagine this was an hour ago now, over on the left here. Of course, an hour is less than 2 hours, and so the drift of all these systems is going to be less. You know, after an hour of flight, the errors that may be within then, they're going to be some, whether they're a little bit or a lot. You know, it could be a little bit off center, it could be a lot, all the way to the extremes of that circle. The reason that we know it can't really be beyond this circle is because that would be a faulty INS system, and that would be picked up, you know, on the regular flights and maintenance and so on. They have an allowed margin of error, if you like, and that, you know, we call that the drift. If the amount of errors that one particular system, because again, you've got 3 of these, is greater than the allowed tolerance, they simply chuck it out and put a new one in. And so after an hour, if there are any errors in there after 2 hours, those errors are not going to go away. They're going to be compounded. In other words, they're going to get worse through time until we find some way of fixing this. Now, I've also shown this on a one-dimensional aspect. Remember, it measures it in 3 dimensions, like we said, X, Y, and Z. So north-south might be the X dimension, if you like. East-west might be the Y dimension, or you pick, and Z is the altitude. So let's just focus on one of these dimensions. And imagine here we've got the time scale running left to right. We've got the INS over time. And so start is when you align the system. And here we've got after 1 hour, after 2 hours, after 3 hours. Now you pick the dimension. Let's just pretend it's north-south, for example. We've got the time there since the right. Okay, so after 1 hour, the system thinks it's where this white line is, but don't forget that there is a potential for drift, and we're going to indicate this with these 2 red lines. So if I zoom in briefly, even though the aircraft thinks it's where this white line is after 1 hour, it could be anywhere between these 2 red lines because, again, of that error of drift. And so now hopefully it begins to become obvious that because these errors compound over time, after 2 hours, even though we still think we're on that white line, we could actually be anywhere between these 2 red. In other words, the margin of error increases over time, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, and there you can see the area that could encompass becomes ever wider. And so at some point, this system will become useless because the error will become so big that it doesn't really know where it is. Now, in reality, you're going to run out of fuel long before that margin of error becomes to complete uselessness. But certainly after 12 hours, if you imagine you were going over the oceanic side of the Earth and that you're flying over no land for like 12 hours, that margin of error could be tens, even hundreds of miles. And so at some point it will become useless. Now, as we said, there are a couple of ways to combat this. There's actually a GPS method as well, but that's not yet incorporated. And frankly, I hope it isn't incorporated. And if it is, I'll certainly be disabling the GPS method of updating because that's basically cheating. GPS knows where you are all the time. And unless supposedly the military shut the GPS stuff down, it always will know where you are, certainly insofar as X-Plane is concerned. So let's focus on the 2 methods that are currently included and work and were certainly around in the time that this sort of aircraft and the equipment was flying. So triple mixing, we have discussed that in the longer video, but essentially the LTN-92, after the alignment, and again we'll call that T equals 0, all agree. And they're all going to agree because you're going to tell each system individually where it is. And so after 1 hour, and again here we've got our, this imaginary box here, and we're flying from the southwest here over to the northeast. Let's assume that each one of these colors are systems 1, 2, and 3. So for simplicity, let's assume that the captain here in red, the first officer in blue, and the flight engineers there in yellow. And so you can see, even though this is our track, the systems ever so slightly are starting to deviate from each other. And don't forget that overall, providing we've got the TMIX or the triple mix system enabled, it's going to amalgamate these results and pretty much take the average. Now, we come over to 2 hours. What we see is that these errors, again, have compounded over time. So we've got pretty much the same route, but we can see that they've drifted even further. The captains is especially ways off now, and the other two, they're a little further, but they're not so far off as the captains. Triple mixing is clever enough to realize that these two systems, in other words, the first officers and the flight engineers, are closer together than the captains. And so when it tries to triple mix, it's not going to take the average of all three and spit out the result, because if it did, if I just take my brush, I'm just going to draw on. Imagine that the combined result, it's going to say about there, if you average these three out. Triple mixing is clever enough to realize, well, hang on, these two down here are much closer than the captains. And so I'm going to give a lot more weight to what you guys say versus him. Now, I'm not going to ignore him entirely, because if it was to ignore the captains entirely, triple mixing, it's going to say that you're around there, yeah, halfway between these two. Instead, it's going to say, well, I'm going to listen a little bit to what this guy says, but mostly what the flight engineer and the first officer says. So it's going to come up with a result that's maybe something like this. And again, once it's come up with this result, it's going to feed that result into all three of the systems, and it will be almost like realigning them from scratch, except it still does calculate their old positions as well as the new ones. And you do have the option, if you wish, to actually flush all the updates and just go along with what each system thinks independently. Now, if we come over, last two tabs of ground school, don't worry, we'll be focusing on this. Let's come back to a two-dimensional view again. And on the same existing flight, this circle here is going to be where our aircraft is. And remember, there's an area of uncertainty based on that drift. That's our direction of travel. And if we come up here, we now come across, we come across here VOR DME beacon, in this case in orange. Now we can dial that beacon in, and we must dial it in. Okay, this system does not work completely automatically in the background like it does on the newer aircraft. We do actually got to dial that beacon in. If we do dial that beacon in, we're going to get bearing to that beacon. That's obvious, it's a VOR beacon. And importantly, we're going to get a bearing relative from the direction of travel towards the beacon. And we've seen that, that's that little arrow. We'll take a look at that in the cockpit in a minute. The other piece of information we're going to get, assuming it's a VOR DME beacon, and that is critical, it must be VOR DME. It can't just be a VOR beacon, and there is a difference between the two. In fact, before I forget, let me just see if there's a way I can show this real quick. One second. This is the thing when you're trying to do these things live. Let's come over to Navigraph. Yeah, here we go. And so if I bring you over as well, Sim Toolkit, we take a look here. I realize it's a right big mess with various things going on, but I'm gonna show the example here. So here we got Newcastle. If we take a look at the beacon here, we see Newcastle, in this case 1425, is a VOR beacon, but it's also DME, and we can see that by numerous ways. There's the way that the VOR beacon itself is drawn, but also we get the DME information here. So we can see DME simply stands for distance measuring equipment. So the VOR is which direction is it, the DME is the distance, how far away. Not every VOR has DME, and I'm sure I found one somewhere, and sometimes vice versa. Sometimes it's just distance measuring equipment and not a VOR. Let's have a look at this CENAB. We can see this is also VOR and DME as well. There is someone up here that is just the one. In fact, is this it here, Perth? I will eventually find one. And that's it. Look at that, Perth. So look at this. This is just VOR. There is no DME. So 1040. So although we could find what direction is Perth in, we'd have no clue how far away. And so the reason I'm talking about this is because when we're looking at these systems, we need to know specifically where it is, as in what direction, as well as the distance. So it needs to be VOR DME. Let's continue on with this little series of graphs there. So the other thing is we need to confirm the ID. Now, if you don't know how to do that, generally if you know where you are and there's a certain frequency, more often than not, it's going to be the right frequency. There are instances when you can have two or more things in the same, you can pick two different beacons up in the same area that happen to be on the same frequency, because maybe one's 200 miles that way, the other one's 200 miles an hour the other way, and you happen to overlap them both. If you're ever unsure and you want to do it in the real, you want to try and be as accurate and as real to life as possible. Again, if I come over into the chart, notice these beacons here. It's going to be a bit hard because I can't zoom in, but they've all got three letters. In this case, Perth has got Papa Tango Hotel. And if you look underneath, you actually see Papa Tango Hotel in Morse code. In this case, dot, dash, dash, dot, dash, and then dot, dot, dot. Now, if like me, you don't know Morse code, you just know that they're dots and dashes, but you could never remember which ones is which letter, this is going to give you the answer. And so in this case, if we tune in 110.4 on the VOR and we can hear this, then we know it's the right one. And if you want to know how to do that, let me just show you real quick, because I will forget to do this if I don't. So let me jump back over into X-Plane. I'll unpause. Let's see if we can grab this dial, this guy. So 110.4. Remember, this one didn't have range information. So there we can see the arrow is pointing towards Perth, but we've got no DME, which is understandable. But regardless, we want to check that one's correct. Well, if we come down onto our center pedestal here, you can see we got this box of tricks, including Nav 1, Nav 2. Well, Nav 1's our side, so let's turn that up. And so there's your dots and dashes, and so if they match with what it says here, well, I distinctly heard those 4 dots at the end, so let's listen. Then we know we're on to a winner. And so if we, I'll just turn that off now to avoid any further distractions. And so that's one way that you can easily check that you've got the right frequency and that you're picking up the correct beacon. Right, let's pause that. Again, promise your ground school is almost over. And so with that one, we're able to confirm that we've got the right beacon. Now we've got 4 pieces of information here, and these 4 are the only pieces that we require to update the system. And so number 1, we've confirmed the VOR DME. Number 2, we've got the difference between, in heading, where is that beacon in terms of degrees versus our direction of travel. The 3rd piece of information, how far away is the beacon from where we are? In other words, the DME. And so in my little example here, I've gone, it's 50 degrees off to the left at a range of 62.8 nautical miles. And if we add all those together, we can confirm and refine our position. Now, don't worry, you don't got to sit there with your calculator and get all fancy with trigonometry. The LTN-92 does all of that for you, and it's then going to erase or fix, whichever word you like to use, the drift. Now, bearing in mind, this is only going to happen for the one system that you've got tuned in. So in other words, if I use my radio VOR1 to tune in some beacon somewhere, and it finds it and it complies with all of this, that's going to be my LTN-92 on system 1, i.e. the captain's system, updated. If I want to do the same thing for the first officer, I need to go to his side of the aircraft, tune in a suitable beacon on his VOR, and providing it complies with the above here, it'll update his. And so how do we update the flight engineers? And this is where I made my mistake in the first video and said, well, you can't. And the reason I assumed that was, well, there is no Nav 3. We can't dial in a 3rd beacon. And so I was saying, well, a good way to have both System 1 and System 2 updating is just tune in the same beacon. I mean, you can tune in two different beacons. It makes no difference, providing they comply with this. But it does make a difference. And so if we come over to the final one, updating the engineers panel, don't worry if some of this is going a bit over your head or it's going a bit quick. We will then show this in Explain in a minute. I just want to get the theory out the way first. And so once again, there's our aircraft and our direction of travel. And I just realized I'm not showing it. So there we go. And so here we are. So there's our aircraft and our direction of travel. Now I've just made up some beacons, and just for simplicity, I've given each one its own letter and its own color, but it really doesn't matter. Again, these could be anywhere at any different points. So we've got VOR beacon here, AAA, there's BBB, and I've even color coded it just to be nice and colorful. And so we've got 4 beacons here in total, and by pure chance our flight plan happens to route us over beacon BBB. Now if we take a look at this, we can see, for example, from Bravo to, let's just call them Bravo and Delta here, these beacons, we can see if we tune both of these in, so let's assume on the captain's side we tune in Delta, on the first officers we tune in Bravo. The difference between these two beacons in terms of bearing, let's just call it 10 degrees there. If we tune Alpha and Charlie, we can see the difference between those two. I don't know, let's call it 170 degrees or something like that. And the difference between Charlie and Delta here, let's just assume that's around 90 degrees. Now, what's the point of me going over these bearings between these various beacons? Well, I didn't think it mattered either. But if we take a look at updating here the engineer system, his panel, there are some requirements that we need to adopt to make it work. So remember, his is System 3, and he has no ability to dial in any beacon in his own right. And so to update his system using the RNAV method, which is what we've been doing in this particular tutorial so far, is, number 1, we need to dial in unique VOR beacons into both the pilot's side and the first officer's side. So both of them can't be dialed in on AAA. If we did dial in on VOR beacon A on both sides, that would update the captain's side and it would update the first officer's side, but it wouldn't update the flight engineer's side. Number 2, the VOR must have DME. Well, we know that anyway, that's a given. And number 3, the VORs 1 and 2 must be greater than 30 degrees apart. Now we can see. So for example, this one here would be no good to update the flight engineers. Why? Well, because we've said it's only 10, maybe 15 degrees apart. It's not over 30 degrees. And so what about this one? Well, that is certainly over 30 degrees apart, but there's one last requirement. It must be less than 150 degrees apart. And we said that was about 170. Might even be 160 degrees. Whatever it is, it's over 150, and so that's no good either. And so these two here, whether it's in this case Bravo and Delta or Alpha and Charlie, are no good. However, if we dial in Charlie and Delta, at this moment in time, there's about 90 degrees between these two VORs. That is perfect. So 90 degrees certainly complies with greater than 30, less than 150. If we tune these two in on the captains and the first officers, the flight engineers panel is going to go, yep, that's okay with me. And he, in and of his own right, is going to get an RNAV update. And in the same regard, if we take a look here, Delta and Alpha, these would also be suitable. In fact, given if this situation here was what was right now, this would be the ideal beacons for me, simply because we're talking about 45 degrees or thereabouts. And as we continue to fly, this gap is going to get wider and wider for a while. And it's going to be a little time until we break through the 150 degrees point. If we take a look at this one, yes, it's currently 90 degrees, but as we continue to fly along here, the Charlie VOR beacon is going to slip behind us real quick. And this one, you know, we could end up being greater than 150 pretty quick. Now, that isn't to say it's going to be any less accurate. It isn't. It's just that in terms of minimizing your workload, you don't want to be picking beacons that you're constantly having to update. Now, bearing in mind, it's not like you've got to be doing this throughout the flight. For the reasons that we said, if only VOR 1 and 2 is dialed in, or you've only got one beacon to pick from, triple mixing is going to have the captain's and the first officer's system. In this example, that was the blue and the orange there. It's going to have them both perfectly aligned. In other words, the dots are going to be on top of each other in terms of where it thinks. And the other system is going to be the one that's off. You know, and let's say that one's now the flight engineer, just for the purposes. Because again, the captain's VOR 1, the first officer's VOR 2. So these two are going to be on top of each other. The flight engineer's one is going to be the one that's off kilter. And so when triple mixing comes to update, as we said before, it's not going to give very much attention at all to the one that's way off, because if these two are on top of each other, it's thinking, hey, yours two is perfectly in agreement. I'm going to give 99.9% of what you say, and the one that's ways off, I'm barely even going to listen to him. And if the one that drifts off at like in the 100, 200 miles, it's going to completely discount what they've said. It's almost going to recognize that system as having a fault and just ignore it entirely. So that's the end of ground score. So let's come back into the flight sim, unpause, and let's see now if we can put this into practice. And so first thing, let's get the systems updating. I've deliberately not allowed or enabled that. And so to get into the update, doesn't matter which panel that you're on. Let's say you've got course screen here. Come over to status page, scroll down one, and when you've got the update mode there, hit the expand button. And now you want to have everything so it's enabled, and so it needs to be disabled is what you need to see. Because again, to enable the RNAV there, you hit it and then it says disable. So that now means this is enabled. We're going to also enable the triple mixing, and so now again we've got everything. When everything says disable, that means it's all good to go. And then we can exit out of that. So let's come over to the position page once that's done. We're going to do the same thing again on every system. So come over to the status, scroll down, expand, hit enter, so it all says like that. Then come over to the positions, and we're going to do the same over here. Status, down, expand, enable, and position. So now it's going to be difficult for me to have all three of these on the screen at once, but I can certainly try and get captains and the first officers on the screen. So you can see it's currently triple mixing. We've got no beacons tuned in, at least no suitable beacons, and you can see that's reflected. So we've got no DME on either my side, captains, or your side, the first officers. So let's come back over here. If we take a look, I am going to pause it now. We can see, although the system's triple mixing, so we've got that T in and it's been undergoing for a while, we can see there is a little bit of a discrepancy. So we see there the lat long is 56.45, 56.45. Here we see it's .92, there's .95. This discrepancy would have been much wider if I'd have paused this before I started the triple mixing, but I didn't. I perhaps should have to made the point. And here we see on the long, it's .04 east, there's .09. If we come down to the flight engineers, we can see his is .13, and on the lat there, his is .98. And so his is a little ways difference as well. And again, this is just going to get wider and wider and wider the longer you're over the sea. Bear in mind, triple mix is going to amalgamate the results. And so if we left these in triple mix, at some point, they are all going to agree, but it is based on that averaging and the weighting of where each one thought it was. Again, back to that triple mix ground school diagram. And so let's take a look. Again, it's going to be no surprise how to update this guy. We need to pick a suitable beacon. So we've got our position overlaid there just for simplicity. And so here's the east coast of Scotland. So let's pick Aberdeen. And on this case, we can see there's a VOR DME. Now, if you don't got Navigraph subscription, of course, you can make use of any of the others. So you can come, for example, to one of these. May take a little bit longer to load up, but you're still going to get VORs. If you want to know how to get VORs, you've got your little cog here. You can view your aircraft. If you're on VATSIM, you might want to use the others. Make sure this is ticked. It's just going to be a lot easier. So let's go with this one actually. We'll stick with this one. So there's your VOR DME at Aberdeen, and it's just squint my eyes, I can just about see it's 1430. Let me tell you, it's not always a benefit to increase the resolution, because a lot of people are not yet allowing the ability to scale the user interface, and this is one of those examples. And so in any case, that's a separate issue. 1430. So we're dialing in Aberdeen. We can see that's on our left side here on the map. That makes sense. Here we can see the VOR, the single needle there, pointing over to the left, just behind us now. And there we've got the range, going up to 104 nautical miles. And so with that, as we've said, we expect that to update our side. There we saw the light is updating for System 1. There we see the letter R, that's RNAV, the update. RNAV updates off the VOR DME beacons, and so that's what that capital R and then the top left. Again, we've been over this. Now, the reason the first officer's, again, he's still doing triple mix. Well, why is he doing triple mix? Because his beacon or his RNAV radio is not dialed into a suitable frequency. Now, we could get him on Aberdeen as well, so let's go for that. 1430, there we go. And what do you know, now DME2 is picking up, and they both agree, which makes sense. They're both dialed in on the same beacon. So if we look down, now his is getting the RNAV updates as well, so the RNAV capital in top left. But the flight engineer is still doing the triple mix. This so far is in agreement with my longer tutorial on all of this, but that's where I left the longer tutorial. What I didn't then, you know, Felis was very nice and left a nice comment under my video, but he did point out that you could update this one. And so let's take a look. So again, if we comply with what we learned in ground school, we need to pick another beacon. So let's, for example, here we got VOR DME. What about Inverness? I wonder if that's even in range. 109.20. Let's find out. Well, what do you know? It is. And so Inverness is about 167 nautical miles away. I actually stayed at a RAF base there when I was in my cadet days. And a lot of fun. And you can see, if we take a look here on the direction, these two guys are currently, what's that, about 5 degrees apart, no more. And so what do you know? The engineers is still stuck on T, triple mixing. And we know why. Because they're not 30 degrees or greater apart. Even though they're two separate VOR DMEs, they're both getting picked up and they're both supplying updates to System 1 and System 2. And you can see there that after the update's complete, it just continuously updates and updates and updates as long as these beacons are picking up. So we need something that's a little wider apart. And if we take a look, this makes sense. If we were to zoom, let me get there, about there, and draw an imaginary line from our aircraft out over to Aberdeen, and then another one over to Inverness, we can see the difference is only about 5-10 degrees. And again, that's shown to us more accurately on this diagram here. So in order to fix that, by the way, somebody's just dropped into the stream, SimStream. Just wanted to thanks for doing the tutorials. SimStream, you're very welcome. Was never expecting anyone to drop in on the live stream. I appreciate what you're saying. You just got this aircraft and you found these tutorials excellent. I'm really glad. That's why I do them. I love the aircraft as well. Felis has done a fantastic job on this aircraft, and I really enjoy the old retro stuff where, you know, the technology was starting to come in. It was the golden era of aviation, but it wasn't yet fully automatic. So thanks a lot for dropping in, SimStream. It made my day dropping into a live stream, and I'm glad that you find it useful. So back to the tutorial. After that little nice surprise there, I'm going to see if I can find another beacon. So here we've got a VOR DME. This one's 112.50. Let's see if we can pick that one up. So we'll do that on your side as well. 112.50. Yes, these are 144 miles apart. Now, if we take a look at this split, that to me looks like it's just above 30 degrees. If we look there, 10, 20, 30, it's about 35 degrees apart. And so if we come over to the flight engineers, what do you know? There we are. We got the RNAV update on the flight engineers as well. And so we got System 1, 2 and 3 all doing the RNAV update, and with that the systems are going to be perfectly aligned. We're going to be more than safe enough to continue our little hop across the North Sea here as we make our way to Norway. So I hope you enjoyed that one, and thanks again SimSteam for dropping into the live stream. And until next time, wherever in the world you may be, take care. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. See you. Bye-bye.